before we actually execute any one of them, I'm just going to show you that I indeed can view the contents of the password file. And you can see we have the unprivileged user account there and the root user account right over here. So we'll exploit or use exploit 1. So we'll just say exploit 1, and we're executing the binary now. I'll hit enter. As you can see, the first step is it's going to back up the original etc password to the temp directory, and it's going to save it as password.back. It's going to set the root password to piped, which, as I said, you can change yourself or generate a new password if you want. And then it's going to restore the original etc password from temp, from the actual password file that was stored in the temp directory. And there we are. So it tells us done, popping shell. You can now run commands. So if I type in ID, you can see we've elevated our privileges to root. And of course, you can also spawn a bash session here. So there we go. So, we can pretty much do whatever we want now as root. There we are. So I can actually display the actual shadow file. And yeah, so that's how to use the first exploit.
So just before we continue with the video, I've split the video up into two portions. If you want to just look at the exploit and the demonstration of the exploit, please go and have a look at this timestamp. Otherwise, we're going to continue with the interview. I've asked Alexis a whole bunch of questions in this interview, and then he shows us the demonstration. But again, go and have a look at this timestamp if you just want to go and look at the exploit itself. Hey everyone, it's David Bombal back with a very special guest. And I like to say that because this is a very special guest. Alexis, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on, David. I really appreciate it.
It's great to have you. I mean, I've watched a lot of your videos, and for everyone watching, I strongly suggest that you subscribe to Alexis's channel below. You can give us the proper name and give us some details about the kind of content you've got on your channel. But before we get started, really recommend that all of you go and subscribe. Alexis, tell us about your channel. Tell us about what you've been up to.
So my channel is called HackerSploit. I essentially create content on pen testing, red teaming, Linux security, as well as some blue team and DevSecOps stuff. So, I'm primarily focused around the offensive side of things. I really like covering topics pertinent to pen testing, more specifically like privilege escalation and to a certain extent, red team operations, especially on Windows, so Active Directory environments, stuff like that.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about Linux escalation, but hopefully I can get you back to talk about Windows because that's a big one as well. But tell us where you're based, because that's like really special to me. Whereabouts in the world are you based, and how did you get into hacking?
So I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. And as for the second question, I got started with hacking pretty early on, but not officially. I essentially got into I got into hacking sort of at a very young age, just really when probably around the age of 12 or 13.
Oh, wow.
But that was unofficially, and that's because the computer I had at the time actually came with Ubuntu, right? So I had to sort of like figure things out manually. So that was my first introduction to Linux, and it was quite a revelation. And as I said, it's actually quite different than starting off with Windows. So
I was going to say that's quite a way to start. Sorry to interrupt you. That's quite a way to start learning operating systems, to start with Ubuntu. So yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah. I mean, it was a huge learning experience, a huge learning curve, especially at that time because of the lack of resources. But yeah, so I started getting into programming in C and C++, and that's when I came across distributions like Backtrack at the time, which is now Kali. And I started learning how to work with the Linux kernel, so compiling stuff, developing various kernel modules, and just working at a very low level with Linux in terms of actually interacting with the kernel. I then moved on from there. I sort of moved into the Linux system administration side of things. That was as I was getting into university, and when I went to university, I sort of got additional knowledge and information regarding networking, development, etc. And I left university, I actually got started as a Linux system administrator. So I got a job for a company where I was essentially responsible for, managing the current, set or cluster of Linux servers, making sure that everything was working, taking backups or automating that process, as it were. Also doing a little bit of networking. And at a certain point, I was also provided or, handed over the responsibility to actually secure these Linux systems. So that's where I, got my start in InfoSec, if you will. At that time, today it's called blue teaming or, just your standard security engineer role. But at that time it was it was called information security, right? Yeah, I got started with learning how to secure Linux servers and, critical infrastructure for a company that also had its toes in the financial sector. So I really got a proper view of how to essentially make sure that the infrastructure is in accordance with various compliance standards, all that good stuff. And then one day they actually called in a pen testing company to perform a pen test, right? And that's the first time I ever saw that side of things, whereby you can actually test the actual defenses and the perimeter of a company and its infrastructure by actually, trying to hack it and trying to exploit vulnerabilities. So, that was a really, really cool thing for me to see. And so that, sort of like piqued my interest into pen testing now. And of course, I already had previous experience with a few of the tools when I was working with Backtrack. So yeah, I then started learning about penetration testing and getting certifications and sort of improving my skill set. And I actually started getting a lot of friends within the industry where I was located. And, I started shadowing them, getting advice from them, just learning the actual tools of the trade. Once I was ready or once I felt that I was, capable of getting into the field, I applied for a junior pen tester role at I can't actually tell you the company name, but so I applied. I applied as a junior penetration tester and I got the role. So now I was essentially responsible for doing some of the mundane tasks for the senior members in the group. So, that's how I got my start. So, my objective was, typically reconnaissance and maybe a little bit of Active Directory testing. That I think was pretty much the most important experience, that whole process of following and shadowing experienced pen testers and seeing how they do it, getting understanding of the legalities involved in pen testing. To cut a long story short, I progressed within that company and, got more certifications, I started getting more training. And this is where I started HackerSploit. Now, the reason I started HackerSploit was primarily because when I was searching online for resources, I wasn't able to find any. And, that's pretty much where I got the idea that if I can at least show someone something or give them a glimpse into this industry and the tools of the trade, then that'll be a really good thing. So that's when I started the HackerSploit YouTube channel. And it started out slow. I was just creating, videos regarding what I was doing or some of the new techniques and tools that I was learning or had learned. And, it started picking up slowly. When I was the senior penetration tester at that company, and I'd worked for probably like 2 years in that role, probably less than 2 years, I decided to start my own firm, which I then called HackerSploit, which not only deals with cybersecurity training, but also, penetration testing and red teaming. That was around 2017. So that's when I started HackerSploit as a company. And that's, where I've been working as a penetration tester and red teamer, and also, providing training in the form of videos, courses, and books, etc. So, yeah.
So, you've been doing this for a long time, and you don't have to give it away, but how many years ago did you start Linux? So you were 13 around. So give us a ballpark figure. How many years ago is that?
I would say I started using Linux around the time when Vista was being released. You can sort of identify that range. So it was really the transition period between Windows XP and Windows Vista. So yeah, probably a good time to actually use Linux.
Oh yeah, so around 2007, somewhere around there. Yeah. So that's a long time, very long time ago. Yeah, I like that. That's when you. So Vista was so bad that you decided to use Linux. But so what happened? Someone gave you a laptop, or was it at school or something like that?
I actually got a laptop as a gift, but of course, the individual wasn't aware of the fact that at that time, Ubuntu was actually delving into that market of having their distro installed, by OEMs. So, it actually came with Ubuntu and a free Ubuntu disk, which I still have. So, yeah, that's how I got started. And of course, it wasn't a real issue. The only thing was, I had prior experience with the computer that I had growing up, which was running Windows XP, but I didn't use that much. It's pretty much for games and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then I sort of had to learn everything, from that point in time. And at that time there weren't any resources available. It was pretty much the man pages or online documentation and books.
It's a really cool story. I mean, it's always nice to get the stories behind how people got into this. So it's a fantastic story. So around 13, you got a laptop. You were kind of like pushed into the deep end, for lack of a better word. You had to learn Ubuntu on the fly. I mean, that's quite a tough way to start. But I mean, there's no better age, I suppose, than when you're young to try and learn that stuff. Are you a big advocate for Linux?
Absolutely. I mean, Linux is just awesome. And, I always make sure to actually recommend Linux for anyone who is getting into computing, although, they eventually veer off to Windows at a certain point. But I think having that experience with Linux, it doesn't matter what level, I think is always, it sort of broadens your horizons in terms of how an operating system can work and how it can be developed.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask you a million questions now, but I don't want to take too long. But which Linux distribution do you prefer? Is it still Ubuntu, or have you changed your mind?
So it really depends on what I'm using it for. So if on my personal laptop, I sort of switch between Ubuntu and Arch. I really like Arch. The only problem is, it's a rolling release distro, which means, you're going to have issues most of the time, especially with updates and upgrades. For my main workstations, I still use Ubuntu, primarily because it's always been stable for me at least. But I've also really enjoyed distributions like Manjaro and a couple of other ones. But yeah, it's pretty much been Ubuntu, Debian. And I also, of course, had to work with Red Hat and CentOS during my time in sysadmin. So I also like them, but I think those distributions are really for the enterprise environment.
So if someone was starting today to learn Linux, would you recommend Ubuntu as your, start with this one?
Yes. Although today, I think I would probably say if you're a total beginner and you want sort of like a familiar interface to what you had on Windows, then Linux Mint is pretty much what I would recommend. Linux Mint and Ubuntu, pretty much a Debian-based distro, because that's pretty much all the documentation that's out there. A majority of it is on Debian-based distribution, so that's a great place to start. If you are looking for a resource to get started with Linux, I recommend the following website. It's called linuxjourney.com, and it's a free website, and it just it takes you through various steps or stages and sort of introduces you to everything. It's it's a resource that I wish I had when I was getting started.
That's great. So I mean, that's just a free website that you can go, and it teaches you the basics, fundamentals of Linux. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what about hacking? What's your favorite hacking distribution, or do you just use Ubuntu, like John Hammond as an example, and install tools, or do you use Kali or something else?
So for my personal work, I still fire up a VPS with Ubuntu and then install my own tools using the PenTester Framework. I really recommend that framework for anyone who's trying to get tools installed on whatever distribution they're running. The reason for that is primarily because when I am performing assessments or engagements, I really only like having what I need for the job, and I can get that installed really quickly, even with a couple of bash scripts. For recording, for the actual videos and, training itself, I use Kali Linux. I still utilize Kali Linux quite a lot because it's very stable. It's a very minimalistic distribution when compared to other pen testing distributions. So I really like Kali. I've used it for a long time. I used its original version, which was Backtrack. So Yeah.
So to explain a bit about the PenTester Framework for those of, a lot of people may have not heard of that.
So the PenTester Framework is essentially a free framework that's available on GitHub, and it essentially allows you to, it works very, very similar to the way the Metasploit Framework console looks and works in terms of its syntax and functionality. So all you need to do, it's developed in Python. All you need to do is just, clone the repository, and you can then execute the Python script, and it'll then take you into the actual console, and you can search for different tools. These are all pen testing and red teaming tools. So you can search for Nmap, for example, or Metasploit, and you can then specify or select use that module. So just like Metasploit, you say use and then the module name, and then you just type in install. And the great thing with the PenTester framework is that it installs all the dependencies for you. So for a huge tool like Metasploit, it'll get all of the dependencies installed and sorted for you, so you don't have to go through that, the process of making sure that you have the dependencies or building it or compiling, a tool from scratch.
Do you have videos on that on your channel?
Yeah, I have one video on that. It's still relevant, so you can, if that's where you want to learn about it, you can.
Yeah, okay, I'll link that below. So you can go and have a look at that video if you're interested in learning more about that. Lex, I've got to ask you the big questions now. I get this so many times, and I'm sure you do as well. Do you install Linux or Kali on native on your laptop, or do you? I think you've answered already. You say you use a VPS, but like if someone wants to learn, do you recommend installing natively or on a virtual machine or a WSL? What would you recommend for someone starting? And generally, what do you recommend people do?
I don't recommend going for a bare metal install your first time around. With virtualization now and the improvements of computers' performance and the fact that specs have gotten better, you can pretty much fire up a virtual machine and that'll give you a very good experience. Nowadays it is pretty much bare metal install or a dual boot, which was a very nasty experience to deal with. So. Once you're experienced enough, it really doesn't matter whether you're doing a bare metal install, because the installers, the actual installers for the distributions are fairly similar and simple to use. You just specify your language, your locale, your time, the user you'd like to create, you partition your disk, and that's pretty much it. So I would recommend virtual machines as a way of starting, and then you can slowly, try and perform a bare metal install. But on my personal laptop, I pretty much install Ubuntu on it and run it natively.
That's great. I mean, so what's your preference? VirtualBox, VMware Workstation? Any recommendations, or what do you prefer and recommend people use?
Well, I think it depends on what your requirements are. If you are getting into this field, then start off with VirtualBox because it's free. VirtualBox works really well. There's tons of options that allow you to customize networking, so you can create your own NAT networks. You can also mount shared folders, all of that good stuff. So it really has all the features that you typically expect from a modern hypervisor. I would think VMware is very useful when you are when you're starting to build complex lab environments at home, where you want to have subnetting and stuff like that. And of course, VMware, there is a free version, but if you are going for a free option, I would recommend VirtualBox. And then of course, you can test out VMware for yourself. The formats for the actual virtual machine disks slightly change, or there is a slight difference. So as I said, once you pick a hypervisor of choice, you're pretty much going to be using that unless you start converting all your previous VMs.
So I mean, VirtualBox, because it's free. I mean, it's a difficult one. I always find with like VMware. VMware has better performance in my experience, but VirtualBox is better for like snapshots. VMware Workstation Player doesn't do snapshots. It feels like VMware have really crippled that product. It used to be a lot better, I thought. But from a optimization point of view, I find VMware generally better. But it's good and bad about both, isn't there? It's great to get your opinion. So VirtualBox is one that you would recommend. Don't install natively unless you want pain for your first time around. But in the real world, when you go and do pen tests, are you taking a Linux, an Ubuntu laptop with you, or what are you doing?
The way I have it set up is a couple of months ago, we actually developed our own distro. It's not really a new distribution, but it just has all the tools we need. It's based on Debian, sort of like what Kali is, but this really has some of the tools that you don't find installed on Kali. They could be part of the Kali repositories, but these are tools that we have curated ourselves, and we've also improved ourselves. So we have our own distribution that we keep up to date, and it's, as I said, it's based on Debian. The only thing we've done is customized it based on our own requirements, and we have multiple images, for different types of engagements. Whether it be a red team assessment, or we're performing a standard pen test. So yeah.
What's that called, and how do people get it?
We haven't given it an official name yet,
okay.
And I think we're working on releasing it very soon. But again, it's not really going to be, I don't want it to be seen as an alternative. The only difference between us and other pen testing distributions is going to be the fact that we'll provide you with different images for different types of engagements. That's so great. It's a very professional distribution that's focused around actual engagements. So there'll be one for pen testing, red teaming, web app pen testing, etc.
And that's not available yet, or can someone get it from your website, or how do they get it?
It's not available yet. We will be launching it later this year because we're still working on repositories and stuff like that. We actually plan on making it public, but we're not looking to compete with any other distribution. It's just going to be a very simple project.
I mean, that's great. It's it's always nice to have these kind of resources. Based on your experience, what are the best tools to take to a specific engagement? So, if you do, that's what you guys use and you use when you go and do pen testing. What would you recommend until that's available? So, would it be like Kali, or what would you recommend someone use?
Yeah, so I think, as I said, this is based on your requirements. The reason we created that is primarily because when we were using Kali Linux, there's different versions, there's different release versions and different versions of packages. And when you go into an environment or an engagement, you never want to have one of your pen testers tell you that this tool has an issue. Yeah. And then the other guy says, well, I don't have this issue on mine. So we use it to maintain or to set up a system of consistency whereby everyone has the same thing. Everything works. We've tested it and it'll work 100% of the time. And then we handle updates ourselves just to make sure that everything is stable. So we were really focused on stability when building that. However, if you are a beginner, then, I definitely recommend Kali. I know there's ParrotOS and Black Arch, but in terms of stability, we used Kali for a very long time. And, we used a really old version of Kali with a few changes to it, but Kali has been rock solid for me, at least, especially when it comes down to doing some of my own projects or working on exploits and stuff like that.
I think that's good advice. It's always nice to get people's opinion on stuff like this. So that's brilliant. How long ago did you start uploading videos on YouTube?
I started quite a while ago, probably in 2016, but that was just very basic stuff. And then once we started getting once we actually got going in 2017, we then started uploading pen testing stuff. So I think around 2016 or 17.
That's brilliant. I mean, so you've been doing this for a long time, which is great. It's always nice, when people share from their experience for people coming into the industry. So yeah, it's fantastic that you've been doing that. Now I've got to ask you like a nasty question. What's your opinion of macOS versus Windows versus Linux?
I'm at this point in time, I'm completely agnostic. It really doesn't matter to me because, I've used a Mac. It's really great. When it comes to specific tasks, I've used Windows, exactly the same. Windows stability has really improved. I don't think from Windows 10 onwards, I've ever had a blue screen of death. So that's an improvement. And Linux does what Linux does best. So I think it's really not a matter of picking one over the other, and and having this sort of like having an ideology based on what operating system you use. I understand the advantages and disadvantages of open source and proprietary software. As I said, I've used Mac before. Mac is a fantastic operating system, but the only reason I don't use it primarily is because I essentially need a few tools, and my workflow is spread across pen testing, video production, and multiple other projects that I'm working on. So I pretty much revolve around Windows and Linux, but I did have a MacBook Pro a couple of years ago. It served me for a very long time. And so I'm really operating system agnostic, as I would say. It really depends on what you're using your computer for. If you're doing video editing, then Mac is pretty much the best option. You can also use Windows. If you're getting into pen testing, then of course, spend as much time around Windows and Linux, because at a certain point in time, you'll also have to get into Mac pen testing, which is slightly different. So yeah,
that's a great answer. I mean, I'm always amazed that people get like hot under the collar about this stuff, because I have the same attitude as you. I've got Windows, I've got Mac, I've got Linux. Mac is my main computer, but that's because of the applications. Normally it's the applications that I use that drive it. And I just found, like I find Mac to be rock solid stable. And it's like, to me, it's like the middle ground between Windows and Linux. So it has the best of both, if you like. But I think that's a great answer. Now, a question I'm sure you get all the time as well is, what hardware? People always ask this question. What laptop should I buy? Do you have any recommendations for that?
Yeah, I can only speak from personal experience.
Sure.
In my opinion, I've used quite a few laptops, but the ones that I've used like for more than 5 years at a go is probably a ThinkPad and the Dell XPS 15. So. Yeah. Again, I know that those really don't have good graphics cards and stuff. And that's because I really don't game on my laptop.
Yeah.
But what I look for in a laptop is, of course, a good balance between the processor and RAM. And it really needs to have a very good keyboard. So the ThinkPad has always been, my go-to option. So, starting off from the T420s all the way to the T450s, and then the X1 Carbon, which I've been using for about 5 years now. And I haven't had any issues with it, no problems at all. It really works very well, but I will be looking to upgrade. And at this point, I'll probably be heading over to, I'm not really sure, but I would say either a MacBook again, or probably a Dell or one of the Lenovo laptops. So I've typically revolved around Lenovo, or at that time it was IBM ThinkPad, and Dell and a MacBook. So yeah.
What about RAM and CPU and stuff like that? How much, if I'm starting out, perhaps I don't have a lot of money for a MacBook, what would you recommend as a minimum?
I would say that you can get a very good laptop, for a reasonable price, and I would say around 8 gigs of RAM is perfectly enough to use. I've used that for a very long time as a baseline, and as a processor, if you're going to be doing virtualization, then I'd probably recommend an i5, even some of the older generation ones. But you probably want to get one that is not affected by the Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities. Because those older chips really lost a lot of performance when those patches were released.
From a hacking point of view, this is a minimum that you'd recommend, yeah?
Yeah, and of course, if you have a sort of like a bigger budget, then I would recommend 16 gigs, because if you are using Windows on it, Windows is going to take a chunk of its own in regards to RAM consumption there.
I mean, I think it's great advice. I mean, I think these days, Linux can run on almost anything. If you haven't got a lot of money, then start with something basic. I mean, you started at 13 years old, and I'm sure that laptop wasn't the very, very best thing. Just to start with Linux, you don't need a very powerful laptop. But if you've got money, then buy the best you can, I think. Any other advice for someone starting out?
I think if you are getting into the field of pen testing, I would really recommend learning the fundamentals, because cybersecurity in general is a field where you have a synthesis of multiple other fields. So you have Linux, you have networking, you have Windows, you have development, you have a ton of other fields that all come together into one. So I would recommend really getting a grip on networking, more specifically, the OSI model, TCP, UDP, stuff like that, how to use Nmap correctly, understanding what each Nmap scan does, learning how to analyze packets. And then, of course, from the operating system perspective, learn how to install Windows, how to secure and harden Windows. The same thing for Linux. And if you can pick up a scripting language like Bash or Python, I think that will really come in handy. You don't have to get into development like in C or C# for now. That's something that you can actually get into as you progress. But just learning, having an understanding of operating systems, networking, and a bit of scripting is a great way to actually get started. Once you know that, you can then start, exploring the actual pen testing methodology and all the tools that fit or fall within that methodology.
Any certs that you would recommend?
any certs
Or like,
for pen testing?
sorry, for pen testing, like Security Plus, some people recommend that. OSCP, what kind of certs? EJPT, perhaps from INE. Which certs would you recommend?
So I would typically recommend starting off with the Security Plus, because that sort of gives you an introduction to cybersecurity as a whole, and it also covers, the actual corporate. It actually covers how security works in a corporate environment. So there's compliance standards. So it'll give you a proper introduction to cybersecurity. I would then recommend going for the EJPT, because it's essentially designed for individuals who are getting into pen testing, and it'll essentially take you from a point of not knowing anything to a point where you're fairly comfortable with performing a pen test. After that, I would recommend the OSCP, and the OSCP will really give you pretty much the skills required to work efficiently in pen testing, because that's another thing that not a lot of beginners take into consideration, is that when you're working for a company on a particular pen test, is you need to be really efficient with what you're doing. You need to know what you're doing, how you're going to do it, and you're against a deadline. The other additional thing, the other additional reason why I really like the OSCP is because it covers report writing, which is very important. It's a very important skill to learn as a pen tester. And even as you climb the ladder into maybe a management position, the ability to read a report is also very, very important. So, yeah.
Great. So Security Plus, EJPT, OSCP, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much the template that I would use. And then once you get the OSCP, you can then start getting into SANS certifications and advanced certifications like that. I think that's at least in my opinion, and in the experience of others and my peers, that seems to have been the best way, because the actual learning curve is much easier. If you're a beginner in cybersecurity or pen test and you dive into the OSCP, it's going to be really difficult. So
it's going to be painful. So what about prerequisite skills, or would you just go straight to Security Plus? So let's say, is there any, you mentioned like you need to know about networking, Windows security, Bash, Python as like kind of skills, like you said, fundamentals. Would you do something before Security Plus? Or if you were talking to yourself, let's say you were like 15 or 13 again, what would you recommend someone do if they were young, or even if they were doing a career change? Would they start with like Network Plus from CompTIA? Would they do something else, or would they just go straight Security Plus and then EJPT, OSCP?
With regards to the fundamentals, I don't think you need a certification really, but it is always useful, especially the Network Plus certification.
Yeah.
So I would have essentially told myself, learn Linux. So that means install Linux, learn the command line utilities, learn how to troubleshoot, learn how to script in Bash, learn about environment variables, learn about how to update packages and how to modify the kernel, stuff like that. That's a bit too advanced, but that's the direction I would push myself in. Yeah. In the context of Windows, and I think this is very, very important, I would have said install Windows, learn about the registry, learn where Windows stores its passwords and in what format, so the different hashing formats. I would also say learn about the group policies, as well as Windows Firewall, Windows Defender, how they work. Once you've done that, then learn how to install Windows. When I say Windows, I'm talking about the standard desktop editions, and then Windows Server, how to harden them and how to secure them, and essentially, learn about how these operating systems are typically deployed and how they can be secured. And so that's on the operating system side of things. And then for networking, I would say, yes, the Network Plus is a very, very good place to start if you don't have any prerequisite knowledge on networking. So the Network Plus is guaranteed to give you the actual prerequisite knowledge required to actually get into pen testing. So yeah, and then on the programming side of things, you can either go for scripting to begin with. So I would recommend sticking to just one. So if you're going for Bash, learn Bash and nothing else for at least a couple of years, or probably 1 year. You can then move on to Python and other scripting languages.
So that's great. So this comes back to the old question. Okay, so you've recommended learn Linux, learn a bit of Windows. Do you have videos on your channel or somewhere where someone can learn Linux in the context of hacking or something like that?
You can check out the Linux Essentials for Hackers playlist on my channel. It essentially goes over pretty much the most important, the most important elements of what you should learn when it comes down to Linux. So there's also a couple of challenges in there to essentially validate what you've learned. So yeah, that's a great place to start.
So you've got Linux. Have you got something on Windows as well? You've got a whole bunch of. I didn't check how many videos you got on your channel. It's lots and lots.
Probably around 400 and something.
That's brilliant. So do you have like Windows videos there as well?
Unfortunately, the only Windows videos I have are on the actual offensive side of things. So I don't have anything that covers the fundamentals, although that's something that I will be working on. So for Windows, I really don't have anything. So if you're interested in pen testing, essentially, performing a pen test on a Windows system, then I have content on that, but nothing or very little to do with the fundamentals.
And do you have like fundamental networking stuff as well?
Yes, within the Nmap playlist on my channel, the first couple of videos cover the USI model, TCP UDP, the TCP three-way handshake, etc.
That's great. So I mean, basically, if I'm starting today, I could go to your channel and I could learn Linux because you've got that Linux in a pen testing or offensive sort of environment. So I can learn some Linux there, and I can learn how to hack Windows. I can learn basics of networking. I can learn some Nmap. You said we could go and do Network Plus, but that's not necessary. The idea is just to learn the basic skills, and then Security Plus, EJPT, OECP would be the path. Is that right?
That's correct.
Just for everyone watching, I would suggest go and have a look at those videos. Get your foundations right. Alexis, a lot of people that I talk to say exactly the same thing. You need to get the foundations. I think a lot of people, want to jump the gun, for lack of a better word. Go straight to I want to hack Google, but it's like, dude, you need to understand the basic stuff. You agree with that?
Absolutely.
Now that I've asked you a whole bunch of questions, so can you do a demonstration on how to attack a Linux system? And I know you've got a great demonstration lined up. So do you want to take that away, talk about this sort of this hack on Linux, and demonstrate how it actually works?
Sure. So again, I'm going to be essentially showcasing the process of how to exploit the dirty pipe local Linux privilege escalation vulnerability.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to start off with a couple of slides, and then we'll move on to the environment that I set up to actually showcase this. All right. So let's get started. As I said, we're going to be exploring the dirty pipe Linux local privilege escalation vulnerability, also known as CVE 2022-0847. So to get started, let's get an introduction to the vulnerability. So the dirty pipe vulnerability is the latest vulnerability that affects Linux kernels version 5.8 and newer. So any kernel from version 5.8 and newer is affected by this vulnerability. There are a few exceptions with regards to the versions that are actually not vulnerable, and that is something that I'll be sharing in a couple of seconds. So the vulnerability was discovered by Max Kellerman in April 2021. However, it was not made public as he was still trying to figure out what caused the vulnerability and how it could be exploited. So to put it simply, the dirty pipe vulnerability is a local privilege escalation vulnerability in the Linux kernel that could potentially allow an attacker or an unprivileged user on the Linux system to elevate their privileges by modifying arbitrary read-only files like the etc password file on a Linux system. They can also, again, elevate their privileges by abusing or hijacking SUID binaries. So again, the crux of this vulnerability is that it essentially allows an unprivileged user, or in the case of Linux, a user without root privileges, to elevate their privileges to that of the root user. So they can essentially get root access on a system, which means they pretty much can control that system and do whatever they want. So this is a huge deal.
Sorry, when did he release this, or when did it become public?
So the actual this was actually made public in March of this year, so March 2022. He actually Max Kellerman actually released a disclosure or a really cool blog post that I will be linking to this video, so you can actually take a look at that blog post, as it he essentially lays out the entire process of him discovering the vulnerability and then trying to exploit it and identifying what was causing the vulnerability.
Yeah, it was a very interesting blog post, and I'd recommend everyone read it. I mean, he kind of like stumbled across it, didn't he? What was it, a year ago? So it's been out in the wild for a while, but it's only recently become really public. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Let's get an understanding of what causes the vulnerability. Now, given the fact that this vulnerability affects the Linux kernel, you'll need to have an understanding of how the Linux kernel works, more specifically how the Linux kernel handles memory. Now, this can be quite difficult if you don't have any experience with Linux and how memory management works. As a result, the explanation of how this vulnerability works will be kept simple and easy to understand at a high level. So, in order to understand how this vulnerability can be exploited and consequently how it works, we will need to get an understanding of a few memory management concepts.
Yep.
The first of which is a memory page, or just a page as it's called in the context of Linux. So a page is the smallest unit of data, typically around 4 kilobytes, that is managed by the CPU and is used for memory management by the Linux kernel. In the context of this vulnerability, we will be primarily focusing on how pages are used to read and write data from the disk, or read and write data to the disk. We then have the page cache. The page cache, also known as the disk cache, is a memory cache that is used to manage pages. So, fairly simple concept here. We then have the two main elements that are really the cause of this vulnerability, which is the pipe or pipes and the splice system call. So the pipe, which is denoted by the pipe symbol on your keyboard, is used to redirect or transfer standard output from one command or program or process or file to another command or program for further processing. So if you have any experience with using Linux, you should be familiar with the pipe command and how it can be used to redirect output from one tool to another. So for example, I can cat out the contents of a file and then pipe that into grep and look for a specific string. So, just allows you to take output from one tool or command and redirect it to another for processing. The next element is the splice system call. All right. So the splice system call is used to move data between a file descriptor and a pipe without going through user space. The splice system call is used to optimize the transfer of data between a file descriptor and a pipe, and it does this by moving references to the page storing the data contained within a file, consequently directing a pipe to a page that is loaded in memory that contains the data from, in this case, a read-only file that was previously accessed. So that can be a little bit difficult to understand at first glance, but it'll make sense in a couple of seconds when I actually explain how the exploit works. The actual core of this vulnerability, as I said, revolves around pipes and more specifically the pipe buffer flags. So by this point, you should be able to identify the cause of the vulnerability. An attacker could potentially utilize the splice system call to transfer a page into a pipe and overwrite the data in the pipe buffer, consequently allowing for read-only files to be modified. The only problem with that is if I do that or I follow through with that, then those changes are only in memory. We still need to write them to disk in order for those changes to be made successfully. So the root cause of this vulnerability is the pipe buff flag can merge flag that was implemented in the Linux kernel in 2020. This flag is applied to pipe buffers and instructs the Linux kernel to write the changes made to a file to the original file stored on disk. So this particular flag here, again, if this flag is applied to a pipe buffer, then it tells the kernel to make the changes contained within that buffer to make the changes to the original file that is stored on disk. So this is essentially what makes it possible. Furthermore, a vulnerability in the Linux kernel allows various flags to be set for newly created pipe buffers. So the actual exploit takes advantage of the pipe buff flag can merge flag, and this vulnerability that allows you to set specific flags for new pipe buffers. So if we take a look at how the exploit works, this will really start to clarify a lot of things. So the exploit works by firstly creating a pipe. It then assigns the pipe buff flag can merge flag and sends data from a read-only file into the pipe, right? The exploit then drains the pipe, so clears out all the data, leaving the pipe buff flag can merge flag set in all the pipe buffers. So the vulnerability is caused when this flag is not reset for all the pipe buffers. So we can then utilize the splice system call, or the exploit utilizes the splice system call to splice data from a read-only file into a pipe or a pipe buffer that has that flag set, which means that the pipe buffer with the pipe buff flag and merge flag set will contain a reference to the data we piped earlier. We can then write data to that pipe buffer, consequently overwriting the content of the referenced read-only file. And again, this you might be thinking to yourself, well, doesn't the Linux kernel essentially doesn't Linux have a way of segregating permissions? And indeed it does, but the only reason why this works is because write permissions are not applied to pipes, because they assume that anyone who's using a pipe is doing it from user space. With that out of the way, I think I can get started with the practical demonstration. So I'm just going to switch into a new window here, into a terminal window, and I'll take you through the various tools that we'll be using. So let me just switch over. All right, so I'm currently on the GitHub repository that I set up for this particular video and my previous video on my channel. It's called the Dirty Pipe Exploits GitHub repo. It'll be linked to this video as well. It's essentially a collection of 2 exploits that allow you to elevate your privileges by exploiting this vulnerability in 2 different ways. So on this GitHub repo, you'll be able to get an introduction to the vulnerability. And right over here, you can take a look at the affected versions and the versions of the Linux kernel that have patched this vulnerability. So these are the versions here. Now, one additional thing to note is that distributions were very quick to actually patch this vulnerability. And even though the Linux kernel that is running on a target system might fall within the affected range of Linux kernels, that specific kernel could have been updated and sent out as a patch. So, an affected version of the Linux kernel could indeed be patched, or could have a patch that fixes or gets rid of this vulnerability. So do keep that in mind. Now, you can also learn more about the vulnerability by taking a look at the CVE MITRE website and taking a look at the actual vulnerability details there. And as an added bonus, I actually referenced a dirty pipe checker or vulnerability scanner script here. The GitHub repo is linked there. This GitHub repo has a bash script that will essentially allow you to check and see if a target system is indeed vulnerable to the dirty pipe vulnerability. So I've already cloned this repository as well as the dirty pipe checker repository into my lab environment, and we'll essentially be going through the compilation process. So in order to compile the exploit or the entire set of exploits, you need to have a GCC installed, which is the GNU C compiler. And as I said, I've set up a bash script called compile.sh that will automatically compile both the exploits that are developed in C into their release ELF binaries so that you can execute them. So let me just go over the first exploit here and give you a bit of an understanding as to what it does, and then I'll go over the second one. So exploit 1, essentially, as you can see, it references here that this repo contains 2 exploits. So exploit 1 was taken from the original proof of concept exploit code that was developed by Max Kellerman. So all credit goes to him. However, I have modified it to change the root password or the password of the root user in the etc password file. When we'll be exploring the exploit code itself, I've modified it to essentially replace the root user's password with one that you can specify yourself. That's exploit 1. Once you've compiled it, you only need to just run it without providing any additional arguments. If you want to change the actual password to one that you want, the instructions on how to do that within the exploit code. Exploit 2 can be used to inject and overwrite data in read-only SUID process memory that run as root. So this essentially it takes advantage of the same vulnerability, but in this case, it allows you to essentially hijack a SUID binary, consequently elevating your privileges or providing you with an elevated session. So again, these exploits, I did not develop them myself. These are just exploits or proof of concept exploits that I found online, primarily from the original disclosure, and I've modified them to make them easier to use and to essentially give you a sort of like a one-run solution to elevate your privileges. So to get started, I'm just going to switch over into my lab environment, which is I'm going to access through SSH. So let me just switch over. All right, so I'm back in my lab environment that I set up to demonstrate the exploitation of this vulnerability. So as you can see, I'm already on the target system. Because this vulnerability is a privilege escalation vulnerability, you can only use it once you've gained access to a system. So in this case, we're going to use this simple scenario that I set up where I've logged in or I've got access as a user called unprivileged, right? And I can type in ID and you can see, unprivileged there. I can also display the groups that this user is a part of. So I can say, groups unprivileged. And you can see it's not a part of the pseudo group and doesn't have any pseudo or administrative privileges. So this is the account that we'll be using. As for the actual detection of this vulnerability, if I display the actual distribution release version here, you can see that it's running Ubuntu 20.04. LTS, and the actual kernel version running in this case is, let me type that in, version 5.15.0. So how do we check and verify whether this version of the Linux kernel is vulnerable? Well, as I said, I've already cloned the repositories that I mentioned previously into the home directory here. So what I'll do is let me just list out only the directories. You can see that we have two folders. We have the dirty pipe checker and the dirty pipe exploit. So I'll just navigate into the dirty pipe checker directory. And if we take a look at the files within this particular directory, we have the dpipe.sh script, which is the actual vulnerability scanner script, and you can pretty much execute it directly. So I'll just provide it with executable permissions so that I can execute it without any issues there. And again, the reason I did that is to indeed show you that I can't really do anything there because this directory was cloned through another user, and I only just changed the ownership. So we can execute it directly here. So once I type in dpipe or once I run the script, it will print out the version of the Linux kernel that is running on this system, and then it'll tell you whether it's vulnerable or not, right? Yep. And if you actually explore the script, you can see that it essentially makes use of a couple of variables and utilities like uname and the cut utility to essentially get rid of unnecessary text. And then we have an if statement here, and these are the versions of the Linux kernel that are currently affected. So it essentially passes the three variables here through the if statement, and if it doesn't, if as you can see here through the logical statement, if it matches any of these here, then it'll essentially display vulnerable. If it doesn't, then not vulnerable. So fairly simple to understand. So now we've confirmed that this system or this version of the Linux kernel is indeed vulnerable. We can take a step back and we can navigate into the dirty pipe exploits directory. So let me just type that in there. And as you can see, you're going to be provided with the compile script and exploit1.c and exploit2.c. So let's take a look at exploit1.c really quickly here. So exploit1.c, and as I said, I've actually navigated to the line where I've specified this, but I'll just navigate to the top here, and you can actually see all phases of the exploitation process being commented here. So you can see, firstly, create a pipe where all the buffers on the pipe inode info ring have the pipe buff flag and merge flag set. And then it fills the pipe completely so that each pipe buffer will now have the pipe buff flag and merge flag set. It then drains the pipe. As you can see here, the pipe is now empty. So if somebody adds a new pipe buffer without initializing its flags, the buffer will be mergeable. And in this case, the actual file that will be modified, which is a read-only file, is etc password. So etc password is a file that is readable by all users on the system. However, only the root user can make changes to that file. The password file on Linux is where the user account information is stored. On previous versions of the Linux kernel, this file also stored the actual passwords and then later on the hashed passwords. But now the hashed or the encrypted Linux passwords are stored in the etc shadow file, which is only accessible by the root user. So just to explain how this exploit works, it essentially adds the following password salt to the etc password for the root user. And I've provided you with instructions here as a comment at the end here on how to generate your own password or salt with OpenSSL. So you can just type in OpenSSL password 1. You then specify that you want a salt, and then the username, which in this case is root, and the password that I set that is actually salted here is just piped. So that's what it is going to set it to. Now, the really cool thing about this exploit is before it runs, because it's going to make a change to the password file, it's going to take a backup of the file, and it'll then, it'll provide you with it'll actually log you in or authenticate as the root user with the password that you set. And then it's going to execute a Bourne shell session here, as you can see. And it then restores the original password file that was backed up in the temp directory and, essentially replaces it. So, from this perspective, very, very little artifacts are left, and, you can pretty much tell that this cleans up after itself. That's exploit 1. Exploit 2 is, it pretty much works the same way. The only thing it does is it takes over an SUID binary of choice that you specify, and then essentially replaces it with its own ELF code or shell code, if you will, and then provides you with a root shell. So to compile both of them, just execute the compile.sh script. As I said, make sure that you have GCC installed in order to compile this. So I'll just type in or hit enter there. And if I list out the contents of the directory, we now have the ELF binaries here. So we have exploit 1 and exploit 2. So before we actually execute any one of them, I'm just going to show you that I indeed can view the contents of the password file. And you can see we have the unprivileged user account there and the root user account right over here. And if I list out the permissions for etc password, you can see that only the root user is allowed to read and write. All other groups and users on the system can only read or essentially read the content of the file, but not make any changes to it. So we'll exploit or use exploit 1. So we'll just say exploit 1, and we're executing the binary now. I'll hit enter. As you can see, the first step is it's going to back up the original etc password to the temp directory, and it's going to save it as password.back. It's going to set the root password to piped, which, as I said, you can change yourself or generate a new password if you want. And then it's going to restore the original etc password from temp, from the actual password file that was stored in the temp directory. And there we are. So it tells us done, popping shell. You can now run commands. So if I type in ID, you can see we've elevated our privileges to root. And of course, you can also spawn a bash session here. So there we go. So, we can pretty much do whatever we want now. Wow. As root, there we are. So I can actually display the actual shadow file. And yeah, so that's how to use the first exploit.
So you've taken the original work and you've just simplified it and allowed us to, you basically type like 2 commands and you get access, right?
Yeah. So what I did was essentially set it up for pen testers. The original proof of concept exploit allowed you to modify values within a read-only file by specifying the offset. So you need to specify, what character you'd like to change, and then what you'd like to replace it with. So I've just simplified that process, and I've essentially, reworked it to make sense from the perspective of a penetration tester, whereby, it cleans up after itself. It replaces the root password just to the point where it can execute a shell as root. Once that is done, it then restores the original password file.
Oh, well done. I mean, it's brilliant. Well done. And thanks for making it so simple for everyone else.
Yeah, appreciate that. So the second exploit is one that I really did not make many changes to. It's fairly simple to understand. I'll actually just go through the exploit code here really quickly. So exploit2.c. And again, all of these exploits were originally forked from the original proof of concept exploit code. And just a few changes have been made with regards to, what files you're modifying. So you can see that right over here, this provides you with various instructions in regards to what it does. And right over here, we have the ELF code. This is the unsigned ELF code that will be injected into the SUID binary that you specify. And then, of course, it goes through the process of creating the pipe, draining the pipe, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the bottom here, where it comes to the actual execution, there we are. We can actually see it here. I'm not sure whether I can explain what's going on here, but you can see that it says hijacking SUID binary. If the path or the hacks path and elf code, and we essentially pass in the size of the elf code are not equals to 0, then print failed and then exit failure, and then in the case of these logical statements, what is then done is it if it actually passes this logical check, then it drops the SUID shell. So system path is the variable set up there, and simply put, it provides you with an elevated Bourne shell session.
I mean, you're just making it so simple because we just have to run a few commands and it does it.
I don't take credit for this exploit because this is something that someone else developed, but I made a few changes to it to make it stable because the original one had a couple of issues. But yeah, running it is very simple. You firstly need to identify an SUID binary, which again is fairly simple to do. And I've already highlighted how you can do that within the GitHub repository. So when it comes down to running it, you just specify exploit2. So you run the binary and then specify the path to the actual SUID binary. So in this case, exploit2 user bin sudo, hit enter. So it'll hijack the SUID binary, drop the SUID shell, restores the original SUID binary that had the actual ELF code injected into it. And as it tells you right over here, don't forget to clean up the following binary, which is the Bourne shell binary, because this is the one that was changed or modified. So, if I type in ID, you can see we're currently root, and we can pretty much do whatever we want. So yeah, that's how to exploit the dirty pipe vulnerability.
That's great. I mean, again, I want to thank you for putting the work in because you've made it so easy for us. And I mean, you what I like about this is you are taking the work of someone else, and all credit to the people who've done the original work. But you've extended it and made it easier for us just to run a few scripts. Do you want to talk any more about this, or can I ask you some more questions?
Yeah, I think I've pretty much covered all aspects of the vulnerability. So yeah, I think I'm good for questions.
So, I mean, when I look at this code, and I think a lot of people are going to be looking at that code and they're just going to be thinking like, wow, okay, whatever. How did you learn this? Is this like learning Bash? Is this learning C? How did you learn to, get the knowledge to take the work of someone else and, make these changes?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. I think, as I said, I did have experience with C, which is why I'm quite good at looking at C exploits and learning and actually analyzing what they do and how they work, and sort of getting an idea of how I can sort of make it work in a different way or make it work better. So, and that's just not limited to actual C exploits. I've also I also know how to develop in Python, so I can read Python exploits. I think the easiest way to actually get into exploit development and even modifying other exploits and making them better is to start trying to write basic scripts and exploits, right? So one good way that I've actually seen working is to take a script that is written in an exploit script that's written in Python, a very, very simple one, and try and rewrite it in another language, right? So that process allows you to essentially find out what you're doing and how it can be replicated, or you can try and rewrite it and make it simpler, make it more efficient. So one of the great things about programming is that it's, the best way to learn programming is to actually just develop whatever you want to develop. So you can always take a look at a script and, perform a Google search on a particular command. So let's say you didn't know what the main function does in C, you can easily find that info and you learn that, the main function is executed first, stuff like that.
So, I mean, that exploit was written mainly in C, is that right? So, okay, so C's a hard language. Which language would you recommend someone start learning first? I think you said either Bash or Python, is that right?
Typically recommend Bash first because Bash will really, and the reason why I say Bash is primarily because Bash, it sort of introduces you to the whole process of scripting and writing scripts for the purpose of automation or to accomplish a particular goal. Because if you go into C and Python, you may be drawn into projects that really don't have an end goal, and you can, you'll essentially be stuck developing hello world programs. Whereas if you go ahead and learn Bash and you learn how to automate backups and stuff, you can start getting an understanding as to why this is important. So you can also write quite a few exploits in Bash, but you'd need to integrate other languages as well. But once you learn Bash, I would recommend Python. And we have seen tons of really cool exploits being written in Python. So take a look at a couple of simple ones. Learn how to develop an Nmap automation an Nmap automation scanner with Python, how to scan for ports using the various Python modules that you can import. And once you know how to basically automate the exploitation phases or the various steps involved in an exploit, it's really very simple to do. So yeah, once you get experience with Bash and Python, you can then start moving on to developing exploits for Windows. So, developing a simple keylogger, that's a good place to start. There's multiple resources on that. So, you can start getting an understanding of how exploit developers and malware developers write their exploits, how they evade detection. Yeah. So
what do you think about Golang?
Golang is something that's becoming increasingly popular. That's applicable, or that makes sense in specific cases. So if you actually take a look at the pen testing tools, the state of pen testing tools right now, Golang is being implemented in specific tools that require speed and efficiency. Yeah. So Golang allows you to have multi-threaded support, which is very useful if you're developing a scanner and stuff like that. It's a language that's that's gradually growing. However, I don't think it'll actually replace Python, because Python has a ton of modules that can pretty much do a lot of work for you when it comes down to networking and passing in web pages, etc.
So always the big question is, okay, so I need to learn Bash, I need to learn Python. How do I do that? Do you have courses? Do you have YouTube videos? Or recommendations?
I would recommend one book, which I think is actually free now. It's the book is called Automate the Boring Stuff with Python. That's definitely a very good book, because it gives you really good examples that show you the power of Python and scripting and how to automate various aspects of your life. I think I would actually recommend that to anyone who was asking me the same question.
And Bash, do you have any recommendations for Bash?
For Bash, I don't think I have any recommendations in terms of courses and books. There are a couple of websites that could be useful, but I'm not really sure if I can remember them. If I do, I'll be sure to give you the links.
I've added the links below, so you click on those links if you want to go and learn about Bash. Alexis, I really want to thank you, for sharing so much of your knowledge. Do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap this up?
I would like to say thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I think, the actual content you're producing is really, really good. If you are getting into this field, get into it with the mindset of a beginner, and just be willing to learn, because this is it's a role or an industry whereby you'll have to be learning every day, as you're able to tell with this vulnerability. So with every new vulnerability, there's always something to learn on both sides, on both the red team and the blue team side of things. So yeah, thank you very much for having me on. I really enjoyed the session, and hopefully I'll be talking to you again.
Yeah, definitely. If you're up for it, definitely want to invite you back. For everyone who's watching, please give me questions you want me to ask Alexis, so that when he comes back again, hopefully I can twist his arm. We can get him back to teach us something else. Do you want to learn about Bash? Do you want to learn about Python? What about C? Anything you'd like him to teach us? Then put it in the comments below. Alexis, thanks so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. And just before we sign off, please, everyone watching, go look at the links below. I've put Alexis's social media links below. So please go and follow him on Twitter, follow him on YouTube and other platforms. Alexis, thanks.
Thank you very much, David.